G'day and welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you haven't been here before. My name is Kathy and this is where I talk about all my pet hobbies. Today's video is the second in a new series of mine where I will be featuring one of my favourite fantasy authors. If you haven't seen the first video, then you can find it somewhere up here, as well as in my description box below. Now, after I finished Timothy Zahn's Thrawn trilogy, I was very keen to read more fantasy, and a friend of mine recommended David Eddings. This is in fact the very first pure fantasy book that I read as an adult anyway. It is Pawn of Prophecy, the first in a series called the Belgariad, and I absolutely loved it. I could not put this down. I read it, I think, in a day. I just enjoyed it that much. The Belgariad is a series of 5 books, and there is also a sequel series of 5 books as well called the Malloreon. The story is about a young boy who goes on a quest in the company of a wonderful range of characters. I must admit, I found Garion, the main protagonist, quite boring in this series. However, I do think he improves in the Malloreon series. But some of the other characters in these are just wonderful. Belgarath the Sorcerer is a fabulous character. There's a lot of mystery to him and he can be quite funny. In fact, there is a lot of humour in these books. However, my absolute favourite character from this series and the Malloreon has to be Polgara. She is a sorceress who also had a white streak, and at the time that I read it, I also had a white streak, so I connected with her. In addition to which, back then, back in the 80s, there were just so few strong women in film or books or television series, other than Ripley from Aliens. So I found myself really drawn to Polgara as a result. However, one of my biggest complaints about this series and most of David Eddings' books is that he tends to draw women as caricatures. They're generally either nags or very domineering bullies, really. And I really object to that, because women can be a lot more than just these two types. Having reread these several times over the years, nowadays I find them very simplistic. They are certainly not as nuanced as some of the other fantasy series that I have read. And they are too black and white for my taste. There is very little grey, and I don't like that. I prefer when I read books where sometimes you will feel sympathy, say, for a villain, whereas, especially the Belgariad series, there is just no room for sympathy for the antagonist. Now, despite all these criticisms, Eddings was a very good writer. They're very easy to read and they're actually very funny, which I do think is probably their greatest strength. And the story is interesting, so is the plot. I really am not going to give you any more detail, and besides, you could always read the blurbs online. I do recommend the Belgariad and the Malloreon series if you enjoy light-hearted, fun, easy reads, because that's what they are. They're certainly not as dark as a lot of other fantasy series that I've read. As for a score, I would give these a 5 to 5.5. Okay, yeah, I am tough. After I finished the Belgariad and Malloreon, because I so enjoyed Eddings' books, probably because he was my first fantasy author as such, I looked for more of his writings, and I think he brought this one out next. This is The Diamond Throne, the first book in the Elenium trilogy. This one also has a sequel series or sequel trilogy called the Tamuli. and I really loved this series. I think I like this a lot more than the Belgariad and the Malloreon because of one character, Sparhawk. He is my absolute favourite David Eddings character, with no doubt. He is much more nuanced. He has a lot more depth to him than a lot of the other characters, and he's also very funny, as well as being a wonderful hero. This is definitely what I would call more traditional high fantasy. I think I've seen it described as. I just call it fantasy. The story is about a young queen who has been bewitched or put under a spell, and Sparhawk, the queen's knight, searches for a way to release her from this spell and put her back into power. There are quite a few wonderful characters in this, but what I like about this series the best is that it is not as black and white as the Belgariad or the Malloreon. There is some grey, particularly with the villain. I do feel that Eddings improved with this series. His plots seem to be a little bit more complex than they were, say, in the Malloreon or the Belgariad. Now, one thing that I really dislike about these books is that I do believe Eddings became worse with his female characters. His stereotypes became even more extreme, in my opinion, and I loathe them. Really, all of them. But because I love Sparhawk so much, because there is a little bit more grey in this, because the villain is more well-rounded, I really do love this series. I would say that out of all of Eddings' books, the Elenium, not as much the Tamuli, but definitely the Elenium, are my favourites. And I do revisit them quite often because I love Sparhawk so much. If you like traditional fantasy, I do believe you will enjoy this very much because it is very well written, very entertaining, and in Eddings' usual style, it's also very funny. Or Sparhawk can be very funny. For a score, I think I would give this a 6.5. Probably only because I love Sparhawk so much. Now, after the Elenium series and Tamuli, in fact, it might have been even in between, Eddings also brought out one-off books. Belgarath the Sorcerer, which I really enjoyed, Polgara the Sorceress, which I did not like, and Althalus, I think, which was a one-off and not connected to any of his other series. They're not bad, but a little bit forgettable. The last series that Eddings brought out was The Dreamers, and I think Elder Gods is the very first book. I detest them. I absolutely loathe them. It is such lazy writing, and they are so boring that these are one of the few books I threw across the room in absolute disgust. Basically, Eddings takes one set of events and shows it to us from different people's perspectives, almost throughout the entire book. It is so boring and repetitive and tedious and dull that honestly, I cannot recommend these whatsoever. In fact, I am notorious for never wanting to get rid of any of my books, but that series, which unfortunately I do own, I'm quite happy to sell off. I do wonder if perhaps he may have been ill towards the end of his life and that's why these are just so boring. I don't know. All I know is that I felt really disappointed that he even bothered to bring out this series. It just seemed a money-making exercise to me. Okay, maybe that is being a bit harsh, but that is definitely how I feel about the Dreamers series. However, that is not to take away from how much joy his Belgariad, Malloreon and Elenium series have brought me. They are quite different to a lot of the fantasy today, and I do think they're worth reading because they are just so entertaining and so much fun and funny as well. Okay, well that is all I have for you guys today. Let me know what you think of today's choice. Have you read any of Eddings' books? Do you like them? Do you hate them? I would definitely love to hear your opinions. And you can put them down in the comments, or you can even contact me on Instagram. Well, thank you as always very much for hanging out with me. I hope you all have a beautiful day, and I will see you next time. Bye.